Hi, Rosaire. I'm glad you're able to make it.
Of course, I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Yeah, right. We'll be starting in about another 4 or 5 minutes. We'll use the pattern I'd suggested to you. I will go first with the Corrupt Illinois book. You will go second with the things that are related in the report, and Tom will go third with discussion of why we do this and how you use journalistic sources.
Okay, I'm gonna just shut off my camera and everything so I don't slow it down, and I'll be back in just a second.
Okay. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Dick, how are you?
Good.
Good. I
We'll
can,
be starting in just a minute or two.
sure, I could be here for the first hour. I'm at home, but got
Yeah.
parental.
I understand those problems, yes.
Yeah. So if I'm quiet, it's because I'm listening.
Okay. Well, if you're going to be our official Chicago urban historian, it's important you know about corruption.
Oh, yes, I'm really looking forward to this. Although coming from Rhode Island, I have a taste of good corruption, but it's
Yeah.
better here.
We've had longer to distill it. Rosaire, I've made you a co-host because once in a while my Zoom goes out, so it'll stay alive with you being co-host, and you can also share your screen if you have one.
Okay. You have all the slides, right? I
Yes.
remember I sent you, okay, yeah. So the only other thing I would think is that I pulled up.
Well,
the-
I don't have any slides. I have the slides from the Corrupt Illinois book. I don't, if you sent me some, I didn't.
That's okay.
Okay. So we probably have enough pictures and things in the Corrupt Illinois presentation. Welcome, everyone. We're going to take just a minute longer. Also, Rosaire, could you email Tom with the link just in case? I imagine he'll be on in a minute, but since he's not regularly part of our group. We're simply waiting for a couple more of the members of the class to sign on. They're coming on now. As soon as it looks like we have a full quorum, we'll get underway. So just before we start recording the session and before we get formally underway with the topic of corruption and the study of it, I need to inquire of the students who are registered in the class. We need at least 6 or more of you to volunteer to make the oral presentation of your paper topic next week. It's very hard to have 15 or 16 of you make your presentations in December. You don't have to have a finished paper. This is a chance for you to present for, say, 10 minutes on your paper and get ideas and maybe find ways of polishing it. So if you're willing to present next week, would you raise your hand with either the electronic function or simply hold up your hand as Elena is doing there. So that's 1 volunteer. We need at least another 5 volunteers, or we'll get 2 jammed in on the last week. Who else can make a presentation next week about your paper topic? All of you trying to duck until December. I can't say I'm terribly surprised, but is anybody else willing to be brave and go next week so we can try and get everyone's presentation in? Okay. Also, Mitch and Scott have volunteered, so we only need 3 more.
Veronica.
There's Veronica. 2 other brave people. Okay, we'll go with the 4 of them, and maybe some of you will make some progress this week that you didn't necessarily expect to make. And I'm going to now share my screen, and I've got a couple of other quick announcements as we get started. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it on this version at a moment. I'll make it full screen in just a few minutes. So first of all, before we start recording, I wanted to simply report to you on good news for our campus. Voter registration and voting have gone up enormously. So if we go back 8 years ago before the presidential election, the 2012 election, as opposed to the 2020, we had only 42% participation in the election of 2012. It went up to 55% in 2016, which was a 13-point jump. And then it went up again, another 10.8% in this last election, which is pretty much the voting rate of most university students in the national survey. And that's a great increase. You'll also notice that the registration rate at UIC has gone up from back in 2012, it was somewhere below 70%. Now it's above 80%. And of the people who are registered, 81% of the students who are registered at UIC voted. It has to also be noted that UIC has increased in its student population to 35,000 students. So this is a big jump. Now, whether that will hold in the year 2022 in the primary of June 28th or the election next November still remains to be seen, but I think it's worth celebrating a bit where we have gotten in the process of making progress in terms of the voting efforts and the registration efforts at UIC. And even though they're comparable with other places in the country, particularly in the difference between 2012 and 2016, we were the leading public university in the nation in terms of the increase that we had. So as you know, tonight, we're going to be talking about corruption in Chicago and Illinois. We're going to start with the book that Tom Gradle and I did called Corrupt Illinois, about patronage, cronyism, and criminalization in the city and the state. This is a process that we didn't just stumble into. First of all, it is a way of looking at urban politics and state politics, but our concern is urban, that is different. In other words, we're not looking from the top down, who's the governor, who's the mayor, what are the institutions, like is there a city council, do we have nonpartisan elections, or all of those good old things that we used to study. We are instead looking, in this case, from corruption, just in the same way we look at segregation and the racial problems of Chicago, and doing this sort of bottom-up study, or from the underside or the underbelly of politics. Tom and I particularly have been involved in fighting corruption in practice in politics and government for more than 4 decades. And here at UIC, we have been studying corruption intensively and publishing reports on it for almost 2 decades now. So our book, Corrupt Illinois, which was published in 2015, analyzes the history, the patterns, the cost, and the cures of corruption. That is, it has an activist section at the end, an agenda for change to eliminate corruption, which again is a little unusual in most of the social science approaches, and is something that we're very much dedicated to. Now, much of this corruption in Illinois and in the other cities and states in the nation, because Chicago, even though it may be an extreme case or an ideal case of corruption, is not the only one by any means. This corruption, particularly in Chicago, but in most of the other corrupt areas of the United States, is rooted in machine politics. If you think of places like Louisiana or New Jersey, like Chicago, they have a history of machine politics. And machine politics in Chicago and in Illinois has lasted over 1.5 centuries. And what that does is it creates a culture of corruption in Chicago and downstate. Just 1 second, I forgot to, Rosaire, would you hit the record button for me there? I forgot to turn it on. Okay, so our topic is corruption in Chicago and Illinois. And so drum roll, Chicago is the most corrupt metropolitan region in the United States. Illinois is not the most corrupt state, but it is the third most corrupt state. So Chicago leads the nation, and Illinois is one of the leading states in the nation about corruption. And we measure corruption in this case by federal court convictions from a database that's provided first by the Department of Justice. And then we go through the newspaper and other media accounts that allow us to tell what that individual cases of corruption are. So why do we say that we're one of the most corrupt cities? Well, because using the Department of Justice data from 1976 to 2019, which is the last year in which we have full data, there have been 1,770 people in the metropolitan region convicted in federal court. That is, this is not an allegation. This is not a theory. This is people convicted in federal court itself. And what that has shown is that not only do we have 1,770 people in Northern Illinois who've been convicted, but in the state of Illinois, there are 2,100 people who've been convicted. And the average federal conviction rate in the state for the last decade has been 44 people a year. That has slowed during the COVID-19 pandemic, primarily because the federal courts have been closed. But the federal courts are beginning to open up again, and our prediction, based on what we know is in the pipeline, is that 2022 and 2023 will be banner years of corruption. There will be many important cases, and not just one or two individuals convicted, but whole rings or groups of individuals who are part of corruption in a very big way. So one way to think about this is Chicago City Council is a crime site. City Hall has, particularly in the council, the most corruption cases, the most federal crimes proven than, say, any ghetto and any other part of Chicago, even though murders and carjackings and things may be very colorful. Per person, we lead the way. And among aldermen so far, 35 have been convicted of corruption in this time period. And we have another 4 that are pending, and I can absolutely predict that they will, at least 3 out of 4 for sure, will be convicted of crimes that will produce federal penitentiary periods. One of our aldermen, former alderman Eddie Berdoliak, in fact, is going to the penitentiary again for the second time at the end of this month. Now, just consider that, why do I say 2022 and 2023 will be banner years of corruption? Well, there are 3 major cases that we know about because there have been indictments, and in some cases, guilty pleas. So starting with the alderman in the Chicago City Council, Alderman Ed Burke, Alderman Danny Solis, Alderman Kerry Austin, and Alderman Patrick Daley Thompson are all under indictment. Patrick Daley Thompson goes on trial in February, and we're expecting the others to follow in pretty quick succession. It also is true that Danny Solis was wearing a wire, and it is expected that we will have a handful of other aldermen who will be indicted and convicted. So the first circle or groups of crimes of corruption occur in the city council that we know are going to trial. The second set involve a series of state legislators who took bribes from lobbyists and companies seeking favorable legislation. They've already had an effect. For instance, Commonwealth Edison has pleaded guilty and paid a fine. The former powerful speaker, Michael Madigan, who is the longest serving speaker of a legislature in American history, was forced to resign as speaker and as a member of the General Assembly. So there's a set of cases that have to do with bribing and lobbying public officials and corruption in the case of the state legislature. And the final set of cases that we know about for sure is a set of suburban officials who were taking bribes from red light camera companies. They were taking bribes to locate new red light cameras in the suburbs and gain corrupt contracts for those companies that were going to install the cameras. So we have multiple cases this year and next year involving city, suburban, and state officials, and they're all underway simultaneously. Now, we have a long history, as I suggest, of political corruption, and I'm going to cover a bit of it. But at least up till now, sort of the poster boy of corruption in Illinois is this fine fellow with the Elvis haircut, former Governor Rod Blagojevich. Rod Blagojevich tried to sell Barack Obama's vacant US Senate seat to the highest bidder. But he was not the first to engage in this kind of corruption. In fact, we, the people of Illinois, have been continuously exposed to outrageous corruption scandals. In fact, this governor, former governor Rod Blagojevich, and former Republican Governor George Ryan were actually in prison at the same time. We are the only state to have 4 of the last 10 governors end up in federal prison. Our state history, though, has other political corruption over a long period of time. I'm not going to go back to the founding of the state, although I could, because the corruption started at before we even became a state. But to take over the last 50 years, one of the famous figures, and I don't have photographs for all of them, but one of the famous figures was Paul Powell, who is the former Secretary of State, who died leaving $800,000 in cash stuffed in shoeboxes in his closet in a Springfield hotel. And over $3 million more was in his bank account. So call it $4 million. Now, you might say, well, many politicians, particularly at the federal level, are millionaires. But what's interesting about Paul Powell is he never made in his salary more than $30,000 a year. It's being very thrifty to save $4 million out of a $30,000 a year salary. In fact, he was getting bribes both for selling driver's licenses as Secretary of State, but even a bigger sum in stock and other money of that sort, and the bigger sums for selling horse racing dates. The Secretary of State set the dates in which horse racing was run, and the people who own tracks like to have fancy days like Memorial Day or Labor Day or 4th of July for their races, and they bribed Paul Powell to get them. And one of the most successful corruption investigations in Illinois history was Operation Greylord. Operation Greylord brought convictions of 87 court personnel for bribery and fixing cases in the Cook County courts. Those who were convicted included bailiffs, police officers, attorneys, and even 13 judges. They were all convicted of accepting and in some cases paying bribes to fix even murder cases in the Cook County Circuit Court. Now, this fine lady is a different example. This is a case of small town corruption. This is Rita Crunwell. Rita Crunwell was the city comptroller in the little town of Dixon, Illinois, which is usually known as the birthplace of Ronald Reagan. But Rita Crunwell gave it a different distinction. Rita Crunwell stole $53 million from the city government or the town government of Dixon. Well, who knew that Dixon as a town even had $53 million? And it's very hard to figure out, why didn't they notice when the first 10 or $20 million was stolen? And it was very simple. Rita Crunwell just wrote checks to herself. She created a false bank account. She cashed the checks that people would pay their parking fines or their fees to the city government and would put them in her account rather than the city's account. The loss of all this money meant that Dixon, Illinois had to go, for instance, without computers for their police cars. They went without being able to do full street repairs. They didn't get to hire the number of town employees that they needed. All of this because one woman just very simply stole the money directly. And there are other cases that illustrate the scope of corruption problems in Illinois. In 2002, this woman, Cicero Town President Betty Lorraine Maltese, was convicted in a scam that swindled the suburb out of $12 million in insurance funds. Again, it's a large sum of money for a little town like Cicero. Or to take another example, more recent, in 2015, the former Chicago public school superintendent, Barbara Bird Bennett, was convicted of taking kickbacks on $20 million contract that she gave to her former employers before she took the job at the school system. And she was to get 10% cut. She was to get $2 million from the deal. Instead, she got federal prison. And in the same year, former Congressman Republican Denny Hastert, who was the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, the third in line to the presidency, one of the most powerful positions in all of the United States government. Well, Denny Hastert was convicted of laundering money to hide payments to a man he sexually abused as a child. And then he misused federal funds and a publicly funded office as former speaker to start his lobbying business. And if all of that wasn't enough, he made millions of dollars on land he sold next to the highway that he got funded by Congress when he was Speaker of the House. And that, of course, increased the land's value. So he made millions of dollars on that land deal. And things happened in terms of campaign contributions as well. Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. and his wife, former Chicago Alderman Sandy Jackson, spent more than $750,000 of campaign funds for fur coats, health club dues, and luxury vacations. Now, I want to make clear, because it's sometimes charged by those folks who live in the Chicago suburbs, that all the problems of Illinois are just the evil city. And the machine politics, that old Democratic machine under Dick Daley, was indeed the whole part of the problem. Well, it's certainly true that Chicago and the Chicago machine and Mayor Daley were a significant part of the corruption problem of Illinois, but they're not the only problem. When we did a study of corruption in the entire state, we found that in addition to Betty Lorraine Maltese, who is, by the way, now out of prison, there were 200 suburban officials in 60 suburbs guilty of corruption. And that's not counting the current cases or the most recent ones. Back in 2002, no suburb had an inspector general. That is, nobody was watching to see if there was corruption except the US attorney when he tried federal cases. And so the sheriff of Cook County made the generous offer that the sheriff's office would serve as inspector general for any suburb that wanted to have an inspector general, and they would do it for free. Now, there are 239 towns in Cook County. I won't ask you to take a number, but if you think about it, how many towns in Cook County would have a free inspector general if it were offered? Well, if you were in doubt, the answer is 10. And some of those have tried to get rid of the inspector general because the inspector general began to find problems. Those are in towns like Markey and Markham and Harvey. So we have quite a level of corruption. We have 4 governors who've gone to federal prison since 1972. So far, 16 state legislators, but it looks like we're going to get another 4 or 5 in this new batch of indictments. 19 Cook County judges, the people who are supposed to guarantee you have a fair trial. As I mentioned already, 35 aldermen have been convicted, 4 congressmen so far. And in Chicago, we documented the conviction of more than 300 police officers for abuse and corruption. This is Police Commander John Burge, who led what's called the torture machine on the south side of Chicago. He had been in the military police in the Vietnam War and had, as a military policeman, watched over the torture of Vietnamese by US intelligence agents trying to find ways to end the Vietnam War. And they thought it was just a matter, if they only knew who was a real communist, they would solve the problem. It didn't work out well in Vietnam, and it may have worked out even worse here. We have had more than 100 people now freed, if I'm doing this from memory, so I may not be quite right, about 100 people freed from jail. And we have paid several $100 million in restitution because of the corruption of John Burge. But John Burge and the half dozen people under him, most of whom weren't convicted, are not the entire 300 people who've been convicted of corruption and abuse in the police department alone. So why do we have so much corruption in Illinois? Altogether, since, as I mentioned, from 1976 to 2019, 2,100 public officials have gone to jail, along with a few of their business cronies. They have not only been in Chicago and the suburbs, but in downstate towns like Dixon and Peoria and East St. Louis, and of course, top of the class, Springfield, Illinois, our state capital. The corruption has existed this long in Illinois because we've had machine politics. And so, yes, it's true that Richard J. Daley and machine politics that began the one-party control in Chicago since 1931 did perfect first the machine, and with a cadre of machine politicians holding office over decades and winning re-election time and again, they have gained dictatorial power over government decisions. And so there was very little oversight or accountability for their actions. And corruption became a byproduct of that monolithic machine control and the political machine setting the standard for the culture of corruption, both in Chicago and throughout the state. Now, I want to emphasize that this corruption has real costs. This is George Ryan, who was former Secretary of State, former governor of Illinois. And when George Ryan was Secretary of State, hundreds of unqualified truck drivers bribed state inspectors to get their driver's licenses. And because they weren't qualified to be on the road, they led to serious accidents and the death of at least 6 children. And the inspectors in the department said the reason they needed to take the bribes is because they were required to buy dinner tickets to fund George Ryan's political campaign. Of course, greed also played a role, as they pocketed the part of the bribes that they didn't give to George Ryan's reelection campaign or his campaign for governor. To give another example of the costs of corruption, besides death on the roads because driving license inspectors in the Secretary of State's office issued illicit driver's licenses. When a building inspector took a bribe in Lincoln Park, a porch deck that he inspected collapsed, killing DePaul University students celebrating their college graduation. And when another inspector took a different bribe, a nightclub fire with locked doors and that were chained killed many young partygoers inside. So watch out going to parties at places that have had corrupt building inspectors check them out. So corruption costs money, it costs lives, it has cost injuries, all that could be avoided. But City Hall has many scandals. I want to cover just one more to give an example of how costly in financial terms this corruption is. I want to talk about the decade-long hired truck program. It was especially costly in financial terms. Under this hired truck program, which in principle was a good idea, so the city doesn't use trucks all the time. They use them particularly in the summer for asphalt, and they use them sometimes in the winter for snow removal. But they don't need them every day of the week, or they need some, but they don't need all of them. So why not just lease the truck when they needed it? Well, the city spent $15 million a year to lease trucks. And they did this year after year for a decade, but these were trucks they didn't need. They sat in the parking lots of Dunkin' Donuts and such places, and they simply collected the money from the city. In return, the owners of the trucks paid bribes to aldermen and city officials to get these crooked lease contracts. And the hired truck investigation led to the trial of Richard M. Daley's patronage chief, Robert Sorich. And at that trial, the federal prosecutors proved that Sorich and two other city officials rigged the hiring process to guarantee city jobs to connected applicants in Mayor Daley's government. So the prosecutors in the second trial, the Sorich trial, described a flourishing machine that enabled only applicants with the right political connection to get the coveted patronage jobs. And those trials led to civil suits for those denied jobs and the appointment of a federal monitor to police the city and county government hiring, all of which added to the costs of corruption. And as a result, patronage hiring is now a federal crime. Likewise, lawsuits over police abuse by John Burge and his police have already cost the taxpayers more than $150 million. During the Rahm Emanuel administration, Chicago had to pay more than $600 million in financial restitution in cases like John Burge and the Laquan McDonald case. In addition to financial costs, corruption undermines citizens' trust in their government and leads to lost lives and injured people. So what do we do about curbing corruption? Based on all of these examples and others reported in the news media, we in the Institute for Policy Studies estimate that the total financial cost of corruption to the taxpayers is at least $550 million a year. And with all the police abuse settlements in recent years, this has gone even higher in many of the years. The parade of public officials continues. Alderman Ed Berdoliak, or former Alderman Ed Berdoliak, for instance, was convicted in a land deal in 2009. And if that wasn't enough, and he went to federal prison for it, he was then convicted again of tax evasion in a different case in 2019 and was sentenced last August and is going to federal prison this month. In 2005, his law license was suspended for double billing his clients. And it is not just white aldermen who go to jail. African Americans do as well. This is 7th Ward Alderman William Beavers, a former police officer for 21 years before becoming alderman. And he was convicted of tax evasion back in 2013. And as you know, the list goes on with 35 aldermen alone. In addition to the underlying problem of machine politics in both the city and the state, public corruption survives and thrives because in Illinois, we have notoriously weak campaign finance laws, and we lack a strong enough reform movement to enact all the changes that are needed. However, we do get reform in spurts. Since Governor Rod Blagojevich's conviction after being caught on tape saying, "I have this thing and it's fucking golden," meaning he could sell off the US Senate seat, there was a groundswell of public concern about public corruption and increased support for ending it. A 2009 Joyce Foundation public opinion poll showed that more than 60% of Illinois residents list corruption as one of their top concerns, even more than the economy or jobs back in a recession. And more than 70% of Illinoisans favor very specific reforms. And this public support has brought about the creation of more offices of Inspector General, the amendment of ethics laws and the ethics ordinance in the city of Chicago, and the lessening of patronage hiring. The effect to curb corruption began again with the current crop of scandals and the election of Lori Lightfoot as mayor and the additional good government reforms that she has undertaken. But to end this never-ending parade of corruption, we as a society need to do more than convict men and women that get caught. We must forge a comprehensive anti-corruption an anti-corruption strategy to be implemented over a long period of time. This is necessary in order to create a new political culture in which public corruption is no longer tolerated. So in our book, which I've been summarizing, Corrupt Illinois, we produced a specific reform program to curb this corruption. It's an 8-point program going from the easiest to the most difficult. First is demanding more transparency and accountability by creating a good government scorecard to rank candidates and public officials and to make the data that's available on websites more readable and usable by the public. Second is hiring more inspector generals, especially in the suburbs. As I mentioned, only 10 towns are even willing to accept a free inspector general in the form of the sheriff. Third, providing civic engagement programs in our K through 12 schools. And the good news is we were finally able to require this with the passage several years ago of what was known as House Bill 4025, and civics or civic engagement education is now required at 8th grade and to graduate from high school. Fourth, we need to encourage more citizen participation in government and politics by changing the dates of election to warmer weather, as we're doing this year, but not for good government reasons. Creating, as we have, automatic voter registration and mail-in ballots and early voting, and new rules for considering legislation in the state legislature. Fifth, we need to adopt public funding of political campaigns as New York City and Maine and Minnesota have done. Sixth, we need to elect better public officials who will not just promise, but will actually carry out reforms. Seventh, we need to change how we remap legislative districts. We've seen this year particularly that legislative districts at all levels are being badly gerrymandered. And at the same time, we need to set term limits for public officials. And last of all, of course, we need to end political machines and permanently change Illinois' culture of corruption. And now I'm going to stop the screen sharing for the moment, and Rosaire is going to catch us up to date with our latest findings on corruption.
All right, thank you, Professor Simpson. As Professor Simpson said, I helped with the latest report on corruption, which is done nearly annually or every 2 years through the UIC's Political Science Department. He covered a lot of ground, which we mentioned in the report, but there are a few points what I would like to bring to your attention. And these can be divided into the good news and the bad news. Professor Simpson painted a very unfortunate, very bleak picture, but there is some good news that we can see they dropped on the board. One of them is that even though when you take a long view from the 1970s to current period, Chicago ranks #1 for corrupt urban area in the country. However, if we take a more contemporary view, if we look just for the 2000s, which is about a period after the reforms that Harold Washington introduced, gave them time to take effect, and we ended some patronage hiring through the Shachtman Decree, we see that corruption has gone down in Chicago. So on a contemporary perspective, Chicago goes, if we just look at the last 20 years, Chicago goes from the most corrupt city to about the 6th most corrupt urban area. So there is some progress, even though it's slow and not sufficient. So that's one good point that we can take away from the report. Unfortunately, that's basically it for the good points. The bad points are that in addition to corruption in Chicago and on our state level, we see some other high points of corruption that occurred in certain institutions and municipalities. Now, Professor Simpson mentioned Harvey, Illinois, which is a very small municipality, about 25,000 people, so like about half the size of a ward here in Chicago, in the state of Illinois. And in the report, that city had a series of high-level corruption events in a very short period of time. They included police officers covering weapons charges for people that they had friends for, so to help them avoid prosecution. The municipality, officials in the municipality, extorting certain certain businesses, including a strip club that they knew prostitution was going on, as a way of avoiding the law enforcement charging them for prostitution, and a tow company taking bribes from them to give them access to public land. And then also they had accusations of vote buying for certain officials during election, which is something that hasn't really been experienced in Illinois since the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, but people were accused of trying to buy votes to influence election. The other thing that we touched on the report is looking at corruption in education. There was multiple higher learning institutions, Southern Illinois University, that had kickback schemes where people were contracting the university to provide certain services, and it turned out individuals played an instrumental role in getting those contracts as a way of getting kickbacks from those companies. In addition, and this is quite tragic, we talked about the sort of the sexual assault scandals involving children in the Chicago public school system, and how the Chicago public school system has failed to institute accountability mechanisms or have go after individuals in the school system who had been accused of sexually assaulting children. The last aspect of the report that we touched on, which Professor Simpson only briefly mentioned was corruption within the police department here in Chicago. There's kind of a running joke when we point to City Hall here in Chicago and talk about it's an area of a crime scene because so many alders have been prosecuted over the years. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the same thing can be said about the Chicago Police Department. And I know someone in the comments wrote mob ties when Professor Simpson was talking about certain public officials. And there seems to be in the Chicago Police Department, certain Chicago police officers basically engaging in some type of organized crime activity. Now, a lot of times this involves them having trumped up warrants to go in and search homes. And then what they do after they search those homes is they basically steal property from people they suspect are drug dealers or gang members who have certain weapons, certain things of value. And then they cooperate with their own organized crime syndicates to go around and sell those items or use themselves to conduct their own crime. The most notorious officer that was prosecuted that we highlighted in the report was a guy named Eddie Hicks, who had been doing this for years and had multiple federal charges about extortion, misconduct as a police officer, and engaging in an elaborate crime network that involves several officers. In addition to that, which Professor Simpson talked on, we also mentioned the amount of the city spends each year just trying to deal with the litigation involved in police misconduct and the need for greater accountability overall in the police department in Chicago. So those are the issues of the report that Professor Simpson didn't touch on, that if you want to read the report, you can find it on the Political Science Department's webpage for more. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tom Gradle, who's going to talk about using sources and the importance of understanding journalistic reporting for how we conduct and organize a report.
Good afternoon. I want to comment a little bit about when we talk about corruption being more prevalent or less prevalent or greater in this area and lesser in that area. We have to look at how do we know and how do we quantify corruption? And the problem is that we're pretty much reliant on people getting caught, either caught by federal prosecutors and convicted, or caught by, in some cases, the state's attorney, some other places, the sheriff. We're now at least equipped, I don't know what is the last 15 years or so in the Chicago area with some pretty good inspector generals, and the inspector generals have uncovered some corruption. We also rely very highly on journalists and news organizations. Also, some NGOs like the Better Government Association produces material on convictions. And at least internationally, they do public opinion polls and they ask businessmen, is France more corrupt than Germany, et cetera. And again, you have to ask, how are they measuring it? What is, they only see when people get caught. There's an awful lot of corruption going on. People don't get caught. And I think you can intuitively see that corruption continues because most corrupt acts are not caught. Most corrupt acts go undocumented. So therefore, we're only measuring when people get caught. Now, so historically, over the years, the newspapers have done a pretty good job of when they catch somebody, documenting it, putting it down on paper, getting it published, and most of those stories are retrievable through the archives of the newspapers and news organizations. Most of major news organizations started digitizing their reports in 1986, and most of that stuff is available online. and you can sit in your office and check any story that was in the Chicago Sun-Times or the Chicago Tribune or the Daily Herald or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal back to 1986. And many other newspapers have news clips that are stored in PDF forms and are somewhat searchable, and they can be available through the Library of Congress, through other libraries, LexisNexis, and several other sources. You can get some of those stories back before 1986. But we pretty much have relied on newspapers to point to us when people were caught, and then going back and getting the legal documents. The U.S. attorney in the Chicago area, you can get the legal documents for everybody who was indicted and brought to trial, and many steps along the line between the time that they were indicted until the time they were convicted are available online, either from the U.S. Attorney's Office or from the courts and from PACER. So we've pretty much figured out how to get that information. Nobody that we know of is really trying to document public corruption on a national level. We have found, with the help of some students, with the help of a former U.S. attorney, and some information that we were able to just follow up on for several years before we found the real document. But the Department of Justice publishes an annual report that they send to Congress, which is a summary of convictions in the federal courts by judicial district. And so that you can take a look at the judicial district that covers Chicago, compare that to the judicial district that covers New York or covers Los Angeles. Some cities like New York and Los Angeles have two judicial districts, which complicate the research quite a bit. But we have not been able to get from the Justice Department the actual cases behind those summaries. So they tell us that they convicted, on 45 people in the Chicago area in 1919. We don't know which cases they're talking about. They don't tell us. We've asked, we haven't been able to get it. We haven't been persistent enough, haven't been willing to spend the time or money to go after it and get it. But that would be a big help if you could tie the federal statistics to individual cases. So we are left with trying to look at part of corruption, the people being caught, and making assessments and judgments about whether corruption is increasing or decreasing. I think there ought to be ways to do it. I don't know what they are. We need some smart political scientists and some smart data people to figure out how we can do it. But it would be very helpful if we could actually get a better handle on corruption that hasn't gone through the courts or hasn't appeared in the newspapers. And so that's about what I have to say about this whole thing. I think our attention to corruption year in and year out has brought about some changes. I mean, we've I think the whole Inspector General movement was, at least maybe not started by us, but was pushed along the way a lot faster than it would have been if we haven't been publishing all the stuff that we've been publishing about corruptions. That's about all I have to say at the moment. Sorry to join you so late, but
That's okay, Tom. Glad you're here. So one of the things that should be said also, so once we find out there were 45 cases in 2019 or whatever, We also go back to the actual stories in the newspaper. So, it's one thing to say 45 people went to jail, but knowing what Eddie Verdoliak did and what Eddie Verdoliak may have said about it, and knowing what the prosecutor alleged and proved in court, gives a context that makes it much more lively, so that we are using not only just the tables that the Department of Justice provides us, but actually then that leads us to doing in-depth research. And Rosaire, I thought you might like to talk about a couple of things. So if one of your fellow students was going to undertake from scratch a report on corruption, how long would it take? What kind of way would you get started? How would you follow the trail?
So the main way we do it in this report is we go to the DOJ's Department of Justice Statistics, and they produce an annual report on public corruption in each federal jurisdiction. You really have to dig to go beyond 2000, but their reports have consistently since 2000 added to and updated. So you really need to get the latest report to get the numbers from 2000. However, get the specifics on that, you sort of have to dig and try to find other reports. Since this report, our report, has been updated with the numbers from 1976, it's much easier to do that because we can just look at our own past reports to find those numbers. But you would go to the DOJ's public interest report, which talks about corruption for each federal jurisdiction. We'll also do the press releases that the DOJ has to end each year to determine what are the major cases. Then after that, I'll look at sort of the documents produced on the state and the city level. So there's an inspector general here for Chicago that produces several reports, and then one in the state. And then you could also look at specific suburbs or institutions that have produced their own reports. And then after all that, after I usually compile all those reports and get an idea for what the major cases are, then sort of go down and do news reports to try to find anything that we missed to add to the pile. So that's sort of the pyramid, if you will, of how to manage collecting this data, where we take the major reports on the federal level, next layer are reports on state and municipal level, and then the last layer is going for and looking for news reports about cases that we might have missed.
And for the last report, just for your work, not Tom and my work on the report, how many hours did you spend approximately?
Oh, I don't know. It does take some time. I say after doing these reports a while, you get more efficient and you get sort of an instinct of where the information is. But it does take several hours of work to do it. Oftentimes it could take quite a few hours just reformatting all the tables to add the new data in. So if you want to take on a project like this, I definitely support you. You could even email me or contact me and I'll give you more details of how to do it, but prepare to give yourself some time to go through all the research.
And Tom, one of the major things you contribute is because of your experience in journalism and your experience in political campaigns and your experience as a public relations person, you're able to figure out what's the story we can sell and get coverage. Because if we did a report and no one read it, it really wouldn't be worth the effort. So can you talk a little bit about how do you determine how you rewrite the data, say, that Rosaire has gathered to make it saleable, and how do we use the report to maybe do a press release or press conference?
Well, that's a good point. How we do it is pretty hard to describe because there's not any one way of doing it. But the first thing that that I look at is what is the current menu of interest that the news media has, and what are they more likely to be attracted to because of other things that have happened and other things that have been reported in the newspapers and other things that this reporter or that reporter have been interested in over years and over the years. So it just requires a lot of close attention to what is getting coverage, what is the interest. Nobody, you don't have to be a genius right now to realize that a story about Michael Madigan is going to get covered, unless it's already been done. A story about Ed Burke is going to get covered. A story about things that Ed Burke did that somebody else is doing is going to get covered. People related to Ed Burke that get into trouble are going to get covered. So these things are, it's almost like music or fashion. Something that happened before influences people's reception to things now. And the way I do it is try to be in tune with what those things are and try to understand what is more likely to get coverage than less likely. Sometimes we've been wrong. Not on the corruption stuff, but on some other things, I've held news conferences and nobody covered them. So I obviously was wrong about what I thought would get coverage, but fortunately, that doesn't happen too much. And my batting average is better than most Major League Baseball players that hit somewhere between 200 and 300%, out 2 out of 10 or 3 out of 10. I do better than that. So I can't say that, you could necessarily learn how to do that unless you spent the time doing it over the years and being able to figure it out. Rosaire should be getting pretty good at it by now. And other people that spend a lot of time on it do get good, but I don't know anything else other than actually spending the time and paying attention to what is happening. The news media generally likes reports. They like something that you've done a fair, honest job of looking at a situation and studying it and putting it in some sort of format that they can deal with and they can write a story about. Once we write a report, it is very easy for a reporter to write a story about our report. They don't have to go back and do the research themselves. They can rely on a report issued by a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And that is the credibility that they need for the report and for them to do their story. Now, they sometimes check and make sure what we say is correct on a general way. If some of the journalists have been covering Dick and stuff that I've produced for 25 or 30 years, and they will check things every once in a while and say, yeah, you were wrong about that. The guy never did go to jail. He died before he went to jail. There's things like that reporters will check on and find out. And so we try to be right all the time. And if we ever are wrong, we issue a correction so that there's a credibility to our material over the years, year in and year out. They tend to rely on it. And so that's another thing that people are first starting out. If you were, a group of researchers at some university, when they start out, they might have to publish a couple of reports before they get any coverage because they have to establish a record of credibility. But once you do that, you're much more likely to get coverage. So is that what you had in mind, Dick?
that was a good part, I think. Why don't we open it up for questions for a while, and then we'll have a few comments. I think we won't take our break like we usually do. We'll just go to questions or comments. Mitch, you were first.
Yeah, so I think first I wanted to say thank you for putting this together for so many years. I know it's November 13, but I know that it's absolutely a part of the solution. I think like you've kind of talked about, putting light on things is absolutely a part of the solution. So I just want to thank you all for your kind of commitment and your vision to do it for so many years. I think my questions regard some of the stuff, Professor Simpson, you talked about in your slide on ways that Illinois can continue to improve our transparency and anti-corruption and just kind of reduce some of that. I know that there was a big bill in the legislature that has been talked about now for a little while, and to do another round of good governance, ethics reforms. And I just wanted to see how some of what you've talked about is reflected in there. What doesn't go enough, or how does it go far enough? And where do we kind of stand right now in Illinois with what you've seen proposed, and what you think would actually be helpful and what's been helpful in other states?
So I'll just take it in the most general terms. There were some improvements in the legislation this time that came out of Springfield, and I haven't seen the details on all of it. But mostly they were tinkering around the edges. I mean, they can't even get the legislative inspector general right. The last one resigned in disgust. And that's a pretty, I mean, everybody knows by now how to do an inspector general, and the way you do it is not to have the legislature control the inspector general. You have to have an independent body, and you have to have an independent appointment and an office that's big enough and so forth. And that's a little very narrow niche. They did make some improvements in some trying to outlaw dark money. But the fundamental things that would have to be done, like public funding of campaigns, so that the people weren't, that the Commonwealth Edison or someone couldn't give you millions of dollars to run your Democratic Party campaigns, we haven't been willing to touch. And the same thing happened with the Rod Blagojevich period. The commission that was appointed came forward with a whole series of recommendations, 2 of which were adopted. Now, it's good that 2 were adopted. We are moving forward, but it's pretty slow pace. So that's why we still keep pushing on sort of the fundamental 8 points that we made in the last slide that's in the last of the book and also in the last of the report. Steve, you had a question as well. I know you have to leave before long, so I'll let you get in, and then I'll let Tom and Rosaire comment.
No, actually, I had a thumbs up. That was,
okay.
So that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Tom or Rosaire, did you have comments about the question Mitch had raised about where we stand in terms of ethics reform, or whatever one would call it, in Chicago and in Illinois?
Well, I don't think, I still don't think that the government and various branches of the government really takes corruption seriously. I think there's several examples of that. There's one in the city where they, the ethics, I think the city ethics board just said that unfortunately the code of ethics is just aspirational. There's no way to make the city council, members of the city council, actually live up to what's in the ethics code. There's also a ruling came down yesterday or today about a former state legislator. I think he's now an auditor with the state, who was, I say he was cheating on campaign financing, charging all sorts of things to his cars and to his friends' cars, to his campaign funds, and they let him off. They said, well, there's no evidence that it was intentional, as I think the way I read it. Well, if you approach all corruption and ethics as only if it's a provable crime, you're gonna take your eye off of all sorts of corruption that isn't necessarily a provable crime. But there are codes of ethics that are not followed unless somebody is really outrageous. All the bar associations, all state bars, all Supreme Courts have code of ethics for their members and for people that are licensed, but they don't really enforce it unless it is totally outrageous. I mean, Blagojevich, I think they took his legal license away from, but they don't. Most of these legislator lobbyists are violating the ethics of their own profession, and nobody does anything about it as far as their professional license goes. So we need to be more serious in this country about holding people to codes of ethics, enforcing the codes of ethics. Everybody doesn't have to go to jail, but if you start enforcing it where they lose their legal license or their legal license is suspended for a year, they're going to start paying attention. And those kinds of actions are a lot easier to actually accomplish than convicting somebody of a crime, which is a very difficult thing to do. And mostly because of the state's attorneys have to run for office in their district with the help of local politicians. Most state's attorneys don't do any prosecution of political corruption because they're a politician just like the other politicians that they would investigate, and they don't want to make enemies. The art of politics is to make friends, not make enemies. So they're usually out of the picture as far as actually prosecuting politicians because of the way it's set up. So that's why you need the independent inspector generals, and the inspector generals have to be independent from the people that they're investigating. They can't be controlled by the people they're investigating like they are in the state of Illinois legislature, the state of Illinois executive inspector general, several of those other inspector generals and formats like that. They're actually controlled by the people that they're investigating. So those kinds of things need to be changed.
Rosaire, did you have comment or?
I would say that corruption is obviously a very serious issue, but I don't think it's important to not lose sight of the progress that has been done, just because I think it provides a nice launching off pad of how we can keep going. So we have to keep in mind that in Chicago, there has been reforms that have reduced corruption. And the most recent city council with the Lightfoot administration, she has instituted things that have reduced the likelihood of corruption, and we'll probably see those effect of those things in a few years. And a lot of the alders that were elected were a new breed of alders who weren't tied to sort of the culture of corruption and the old Chicago machine. So it takes time, but I think it will eventually occur that we'll see a serious reduction in corruption and more accountability here in the city. I think what makes it so entrenched and so complicated is that when you look at the institutions of Illinois and the institutions of Chicago, there's all these incentives that encourage people to act in a corrupt manner. So in Chicago, it has this great paradox where we have a very large city council, so it would seem very democratic, but we really don't have a good separation of powers. So there's not a lot of accountability. In a good separation of powers, the executive branch, the mayor, would be in charge of all the administration, and then the alders would be in charge of all legislation. But we mix those up here in the city, where the alders have a tremendous amount of administrative powers over their ward. And as the Ed Burke scandal, they use that for their own advantage, engage in all these corrupt practices, while the mayor has a tremendous amount of influence in how the council is run and what legislation gets aside. And that's created a sort of a culture and a history of a rubber stamp city council. So to uproot that, you kind of have to change how the structure of the city is run. And Professor Simpson and Tom's work kind of shows that there are various areas where we do that. We talk about campaign finance reform, where we kind of have to look at a deeper institutional level to really uproot all these incentives that encourage politicians to act in a corrupt manner.
So we have a series of questions. By the way, Mitch put in the chat the news story about the Board of Elections decision. Sean, I believe you were next, and then Rodrigo, and then David, and then Wujay.
Hey, everybody. I just kind of, I guess, somewhat of a simple question. And Mr. Rozier kind of was, I guess, touching on it a little bit. You know, and I'll frame this a certain way. So like I've heard it said or whatever, like when it comes to like police officers, a lot of them join the police force, you know, young, idealistic, you know, they want to change the world. They want to be good people. And they are good people. They get in it, but somehow the nature of the job corrupts them or makes them, you know, angry or bitter or whatever the case may be. And I guess what I kind of want to frame is almost the same way with like politicians and elected officials. We have these people that ideally are, you know, mean well, they want to do good, they want to help the community, they want to be hopefully, a positive influence in their area. But, you know, somehow the nature of the business corrupts them. So I guess my thing is, as much as we can talk about, you know, these particular elected officials that have, you know, committed crimes and things of that nature, how much of it do you know, attribute to just the culture of what happens around them? I could be, let's say, an honest guy, and I come in the game and I just want to do right by my constituents, but I have all these people kind of coming at me with bribes and different things, and, you know, hey, can you do this for me? Can you do that? And then, you know, ultimately, if I don't stand on my morals and principles, I'm liable to fall into those same traps. So I just wanted to hear, I guess, some thoughts along that line.
Yeah, we conclude in all of our work that the chief problem is the culture of corruption. And we conclude that the culture of corruption was created historically by the Chicago machine and the past corruption. But there are things you can do. I'll just give one example from when I was alderman and Leon Dupre and Paul Douglas before me. One of the problems is we simply had a gift rule. We wouldn't take a bribe. You know, if someone was very grateful to our office that solved, you know, kept them from being evicted or something. Yeah, they could bring a cake and everybody in the office could have cake. But if they brought an envelope with money in it, we wouldn't accept it. You know, we would, that was just a standing rule. I think under Dupre and Douglas and I, the rule was $25. So, you know, if someone brought in some modest thing like a cake or flowers or something like that, that everyone would share, you know, who would help them with their problem, that was fine. But if it was an actual potential bribe that would influence a decision, that wasn't fine. And the way we solved that was by having an actual rule, which has never been adopted by the city or anybody else, but aldermen who didn't want to get caught up in the culture devised a rule like that for themselves. I'm going to take some other questions because we've got a long line of people, but we'll come back if we need to get further commentary. Rodrigo, I believe you were next, and then David.
Thank you so much. I have a question on trying to figure out the data on corruption, since it's so specific and so sort of limited to whatever gets caught on the media and whoever gets prosecuted on the courts. Is there some leverage in trying to understand this phenomenon as in some sort of categories, in the sense of maybe corruption that's related to private gains could be differentiated from corruption that's related to financing a party or something along these lines? Maybe categories could also be useful in pointing certain deficiencies, say corruption that's linked to a certain service could have something to do with public contracts or something along these lines. I'm sure it can get a little bit lost in complexity here, but is there a point to at least exploring this option in terms of methods?
Yeah, there are a couple of approaches, and I'll let the others comment. So first of all, we define corruption as a private gain for the use of your public office, whether you're a bureaucrat and you take a bribe to give someone a welfare payment or something, or you're an alderman and you take a bribe for passing a piece of legislation from a corporation, or you give out a corrupt contract and you get a part of it back like Barbara Byrd Bennett did. So that's our definition of corruption. And then your question is, can you categorize it? And that there are several ways of categorizing it. One, what we found empirically as we looked is that there were different patterns of corruption for different agencies and groups. So for instance, aldermen generally took bribes for what's called aldermanic privilege. It was usually for zoning. It was usually a small amount in the old days at $500. So if, of the 35 cases of aldermanic corruption that have been proven so far, I would guess that 30 of them were either zoning or building bribes. Someone gave them money to get either a zoning permit or to not have the inspectors come by. On the other hand, Blagojevich didn't take bribe. If we're talking about the governors, their bribes were quite different. What we did in the Corrupt Illinois book was in fact develop a chapter for each level of government, state government, aldermanic, police. The John Burge case is very different from the Blagojevich case and so forth. But we found that the patterns within the agencies were indeed different. There was a different standard pattern of corruption. There is no universal worldwide accepted pattern, accepted terminology for what types of corruption are. There are some measures like Transparency International, but those are perceptions of corruption, which is a whole different thing than what is the actual level of corruption. So I don't know whether that answers your question. I don't know whether Tom or Rosaire have other responses, but yes, if we could create, we created an understanding of corruption and we created a kind of typology, but it was based on the sort of standard corruption for that level of government and that process, not a universal one that could be applied in New Zealand.
Well, I just wanted to add, it goes back a little bit to what Rosaire said about progress. One of the things that I think we were very early, 10 years ago, we pointed out that there's a real problem with legislators and aldermen being lobbyists in other forms of government. And it set it up, it could set up a log rolling situation. You vote for what I want in the city council. I'll vote for what you want in the state government. All right. And on those kind of situations where if there's no money exchanging hands, they'll never get caught. But still, it is very well. They'll never get caught unless somebody has videotape or tape of them setting up the deal. But it is on the face of it. It is corrupt. It is corrupt that somebody that is elected to represent citizens from a certain district will take an action that hurts them through the state government, even though they're a local official. They're taking an action that's hurting their legislature, allowing a red light camera or a speed camera to bilk the people in their district because it's been enacted on the state level and they're on the local level. Those kinds of things. We're seeing some progress in that. At least the news media is starting to pay a lot of attention to legislator lobbyists, and a number of these recent indictments have been of legislator lobbyists. actually indictments actually involve basic bribes, but the relationship in itself is corrupt. I do see progress. I mean, I think that everything that's done to tighten up the rules, to get more enforcement, to get more public attention on it, to elect better officials, is progress. The problem is it fast enough to have a real impact, and is it consistent enough? Going back to the problem of the culture that somebody raised, I do believe that most public officials do not wake up in the morning and say, how can I fleece the public today? They don't. But they have pressures on them to raise money for reelection. They have pressures on them to be simpatico with their other members. So they're constantly pressure on them to vote for this, to vote for that. And after a while, they see other people gaining personally from the work that they do, the favors that they give, and they start saying, well, I should get in on that too. I mean, what's wrong with me taking a second job with a law firm that happens to have clients that benefit from state government? They need somebody in state government to look after them. So they justify it as being just an extension of what they're doing anyhow, and just the extension of what everybody else is doing also. And pretty soon they're taking payments, for actual political action, and pretty soon they're getting sloppy about it, and they get caught. And I think that's one of the reasons why they get caught is it's so, on certain levels, it's so prevalent that they get sloppy about it. I mean, some of the things when you read about how these guys got caught, it's just like, what are they? Are they crazy? I mean, they actually discuss corrupt activity in emails, and and everybody knows an email lives forever. What are they thinking? What are they thinking? But I think it's just so, over the years, they're so used to seeing that and doing similar things and know people that is involved in it, that they get casual about it and they get sloppy.
Rosaire, did you have comments on possible categories?
I would just say, so going back to the research pyramid that I talked about before, that kind of predetermines the report and how we look at that in terms of what are the sources we examine. So at the base, again, that's the Department of Justice. So that's about criminal corruption. We know people are being indicted or prosecuted. And then going through the municipal and state reports, that can sometimes be misconduct or violations of municipal and state regulations, but those people may not be necessarily prosecuted on a federal level. And then looking at, journalist and reports, those are kind of fishy situations that come about, but we may not see any legal ramifications. So that's kind of guides how it's processed and how they end up being categorized. I think in addition to that, we have clear criminal prosecutions where people did things wrong. And then we have things where people did not necessarily do crimes, but they overstep the boundaries of their profession, which is something we kind of see that's more prevalent with police, where they are engaging in police misconduct, but they're not necessarily being charged with anything. And then, this is kind of what Tom was talking about. There is a whole nother area of stuff that is highly questionable, but perfectly legal and not considered misconduct in any formal sense at all. So to provide one example, we talked about the report about ComEd and their bribery scheme, which was illegal. Now, there was a talk about the city of Chicago municipalizing its energy system, and that would be taken over the section of the energy system that is now provided by ComEd. And part of that discussion was that the city of Chicago has a law that's saying that it will not cooperate with any organization that has been prosecuted for corruption and misconduct. Now, a strong interpretation of the law would be like, well, then we have to municipalize our energy supply, or we have to go find another company that decides to do it with ComEd. But ComEd has actually never been prosecuted because they signed a non-prosecution agreement with the federal government saying that we're not going to prosecute you as long as you pay this fine. And a lot of people had that fine be a slap in the wrist. And it didn't really cut into any of the profits that people expected they got from this bribery scheme. So is that corruption? Is the city council of Chicago participating in that? Well, technically, no. But it's, someone who wanted to have a lot of moral fortitude in the city and be like, no, we should really reach a high bar. We'd be like, we need to cancel these contracts with ComEd at the earliest opportunity, and be damned to what it costs the city. We need to be a place of integrity. But that doesn't happen. There's not a political will in the city council to make that happen. So that's kind of one of those situations where the politics of it, even though everything's highly questionable, nothing's illegal, nothing's a misconduct, nothing like that. People are just carrying on as it was, even though it's very questionable and could probably produce corruption that is illegal later on.
So David lost his internet connection. If he comes back in, we'll interrupt and let him ask his question immediately before he loses it again. But Wujie, you're up for your question or comment.
I just had something to say about those professional organizations. So rights professional organizations should take things more seriously, and bar associations taking things more seriously. I guess we can encourage professionals in the fields to just tell on each other if there is a code of ethics violation, someone broke the code, encourage them to report, to uphold the morals, the ethics of their profession, and that would curb corruption. It makes sense. But do you have ideas of any other organization besides professional organizations requiring license, trying to do something about corruption? Any other organization that should? So, for example, maybe the newspaper journalism should be more aggressive about corruption investigation and so on. So if you could comment on that, I'd be grateful.
I'll make just one comment that's a little off, and then I'll have Tom respond specifically to your question. But there are several other senses of corruption besides the one of where you're actually getting a very clear benefit for your private benefit for public action. There is moral corruption. The Trump administration is sort of, besides their obvious corruption in the sense of stealing, like when they redecorated their offices for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the rule of their agency was you could only spend $5,000. That, would be morally wrong anyway, whether or not the rules affect. But you can have a situation of institutional corruption. For instance, and this is in my new book about American democracy, but you can have a situation, for instance, a university professor could be an expert witness in a trial for drug companies or for the tobacco industry or something like that, and get paid a huge fee or get a speaking fee for backing them, even though they knew the evidence was wrong. Really, there are all sorts of ways in which professional behavior can be undermined without necessarily breaking a law. but Tom, I'll let you go back to Wujay's basic point. So if corruption includes things like actions by lawyers and others that are licensed, is there a way to have better control?
Who would have the better control? They need to, if the profession itself needs to have standards, and they need to hold the people to the standards. And they usually don't, until it becomes either, a public scandal or, some other outrageous event uncovers it. Somebody mentioned journalists, and I come from a newspaper family, and I know a little bit about, and was a journalist myself early in my career. And there are frequently journalists who are caught cheating, even things as minor as exaggerating the amount of danger they were in a war situation when they covered a war. And Brian Williams had his career basically ruined because he exaggerated the amount of danger that he personally said he was in. And the news organization could not defend that. So they demoted him. I also worked for a corporation that had they had a standard against stealing, and they generally enforced it. But the guy who bought printing for the organization was a frequent luncheon guest of the big printing companies, and went on some golf trips, on the expense of the printing company. He got away with it because he didn't actually take money and put it in his pocket. Another person was involved with having the fleet, their fleet of cars serviced, and he was taking money from the garage that was servicing the cars. So he got fired. They didn't turn him over to the police. They gave him a statement to sign admitting to what he did, and they fired him. So he went on to steal from some other company. But that is one way to get rid of things very quickly, and get people out of the organization, and they can't corrupt the organization any further. You get them to admit on paper so that they can't come back and sue and say they were fired unjustly. They signed a statement admitting to what they did, and then they got fired. I don't know what they do in academia about people that don't commit a capital offense, but do commit things that are wrong. How they're disciplined. But I think having standards and enforcing them consistently and fairly, so that you can't enforce it more stringently against your employees of color than you do to the other employees, or who are from white, or you can't enforce it unevenly against women than you do against men. But you have to enforce it fairly, consistently. You can be lenient and give some exceptions, but you have to be consistent about it. And everybody has to know that, this is wrong. You're going to get disciplined for this, but if you go this far, you're going to get fired. And that needs to be known and be understood by everybody, that, these are the rules and these are how they're going to be administered. And the same thing needs to be done in the police department. There's all sorts of things that go on in policing, which they learn. The young policemen learn them from the old policemen, and the old policemen learned them from the policemen before them. But there's all sorts of things that they do to cut corners. They have a lot of authority. They're allowed to pretty much misbehave up to a point, and then if it gets in the newspaper or the mayor hears about it, they get disciplined. It needs to be better, and not wait till things get in the newspaper before somebody gets disciplined.
Veronica, you were next.
Yeah, so it was mentioned that at the federal level, reports are given to Congress. The offices of